Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. This is not a video I would have ever expected to be making, but we are going to talk about Lorcana gameplay today. It's important to the long-term outlook of how we think Lorcana might do in the market once it gets here to understand the gameplay itself. Games need to actually be fun. They can't just all be about rampant speculation. So I've pulled out my pre-modern format slide deck to use as visual aids, and I'm just going to go through and talk about how Lorcana plays. Now, the short of this is it's essentially a copy of Magic. It's a clone of Magic. Almost everything about the game is stolen straight from Magic with very, very little difference. So first off, you will start with 7 cards in your hand. You have an effect in the game called Exerting, which is just you turn the card sideways. Yes, it's very much like tapping. In fact, it's exactly like tapping. And you have to understand that there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to game design. Every concept in a game has already been done. There's very little new original ideas floating around. So it's not a bad thing that various parts of the game design are stolen from other games. We expect that. But what we would like to see is elements taken, put together in novel ways to create a different and new experience. So besides exerting to tap, you have readying a card, which is untapping. Then you start your turn. So at the beginning of your turn, you have the ready step, when you ready all your cards, which is just your untap step. Then you have the set step, which is exactly like Magic's upkeep step. Then you have the draw step, which is exactly like Magic's draw step, where you draw 1 card from your deck. Then you go into the main phase. Now, here's where you'll see the first kind of difference. During the main phase in Lorcana, you don't really have land. You don't have land at all. And instead, what you do is every turn, you can take 1 card from your hand, show it to all of your opponents, and then place it face down in what's called your inkwell. And so the idea is that you're casting these spells and you're doing like magical artwork and stuff. And so your inkwell is your resource pool. And every turn you can take 1 card from your hand, place it under your inkwell, and from then on you can exert cards in your inkwell to get ink, which powers things you do. It lets you cast spells or activate abilities. I've seen conflicting reports about whether or not any card in your deck can be placed in the inkwell. I've actually seen one source that says yes, any card, and another source that says no, only certain cards. So I don't know. Then after you've potentially put something in your inkwell, you can play cards. Now, you can play what they call characters, which are just creatures. You can play actions, which are like sorceries potentially in Magic. Again, I have a lightning bolt here, which is an instant, but I can't find anything definitive yet on whether Lorcana makes a distinction between sorcery speed and instant speed the way Magic does, or a distinction of typically not being able to play sorceries on your opponent's turn. I'm not sure about those things. On your own turn, you can play actions, which essentially are like sorceries for Magic. You can also use character abilities as long as they don't require exerting the character. So essentially, Lorcana has a system of haste and summoning sickness the same way that Magic does. You can't exert a character on the first turn, they're in play under normal conditions. You would exert cards in your inkwell to create ink, to cast things or use abilities, and all the ink is colorless. There is no concept of colored ink in Lorcana. And so no matter what color card you put in the inkwell, it's just face down when it gets here. And so it's colorless ink, and that pays for anything. And part of the way to kind of balance this is when you go to deck construction, it says you can only have 2 different colors of cards in the deck maximum. You can have 1 or 2, but you can't have like a 5-color deck like you do in Magic. And then lastly, there are item cards, which are basically exactly like artifacts are in Magic. They just call them items instead. So some items have effects that cause them to exert, some don't, and effects may or may not require you to exert cards in your inkwell to create ink to use the ability. On to combat, which in Lorcana is called questing because it's Disney. They don't want fighting, they don't want killing each other, they want questing. And so the idea in Lorcana is that you are looking for pieces of lore, which I don't know, just sounds like not very motivating. But to quest a character, you exert them. And so they can't exert, like I said, the first turn that they are in play. So they have essentially summoning sickness. So you exert your character to quest with. And another thing that's not clear to me so far from various sources of rules that I've read is whether you have to exert all your questers at once during the turn or you just do them piecemeal. It doesn't really matter because there is no blocking mechanic like there is in Magic. So when you exert to go questing for lore in Lorcana, if this was a 2 power like it is here on this Jackal Pup, even though power has a different word in Lorcana, it would essentially find 2 lore for you. And when you get to 20 lore found, you win the game. And understand, this is the exact same mechanic as attacking your opponent in Magic if they were unable to block. You would attack your opponent, they would take 2 damage, and when they take 20 damage total, you win the game. So it's the exact same thing. It's just instead of using the language of dealing damage and attacking and life and dying, instead, you're questing for lore and you find it, and when you find 20 lore, you win. So they've just taken Magic combat and they've reskinned it in a more family-friendly way. One actual interesting innovation in Lorcana is, let's say that your opponent has some creatures who quested for lore on the previous turn, and so they are still exerted, they're still tapped from that. Now during your turn, you can challenge them. And essentially, to challenge, you exert your creature, and your creature and their creature have a one-on-one single combat. And so that is kind of interesting. I'll get more into it in a little bit of why exactly that's interesting. Damage does not heal on creatures at the end of every turn the way it does in Magic. Damage stays on creatures for the entire game in Lorcana. And if a creature is knocked out from being individually challenged and beaten, they get banished, as they call it in Lorcana, which just means it goes to your graveyard. So I can't find anything yet about end of turn, if there are explicit end of turn steps, and I can't find anything about whether there is a maximum hand size under normal conditions the way there is in Magic. When it comes to deck construction, your deck has to have at least 60 cards and no more than 4 copies of any single card. And remember, because there are no lands, instead you take any card from your deck, put it into your inkwell. You're not going to have the normal 15, 20-ish kind of number of land cards in a deck. And like I said previously, 2 color decks maximum. So you can make a deck out of 1 color or 2 colors. So overall, the biggest differences between these games. First, the inkwell versus land. And it's unfortunate for Magic. One of the worst decisions Richard Garfield made in the original design of Magic was land. Until the end of time, when we stop playing Magic, we will forever have games with Mana Flood and Mana Screw, and trying to get the correct mana curve for the cards that you want to cast from your deck is going to dictate deck construction forever in Magic. And it's really one of the worst bits of game design in Magic, and unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with it. I don't see a way to get ourselves away from using land in Magic. So Lorcana goes around that, and I think they do that in a really good way. I think that's definitely a beneficial difference that they have from Magic. They've ripped most of the Magic rules, or really they ripped all of the Magic rules, and then they just kind of, with a scalpel around the edges, they've changed a couple of them. I think this change, using the inkwell, putting 1 card from your hand in it every turn, I think that's a good change. Now, mana color management. You have no colored mana. And the consequence of having no colored mana is you have to limit deck construction to just 2 different colors. I think that's really bad, because when there's no colored mana, if you let everybody use any card they wanted, eventually the meta would evolve into just a couple of viable decks that were all colored. You foreclose the possibility of people making 3 color, 4 color, 5 color decks by saying, well, you can only have 2 colors because we don't have colored mana in this game. So I think the entire game being colored mana is really a bad thing. It limits your ability to do deck design. It limits playability of a lot of strategies people would probably like to explore. No one who plays Magic really says at this point that drawing the right color of mana consistently in their deck is a huge problem, simply because there are so many good viable cards for finding lands out of your deck. There are so many good multicolored lands. The number of cards in the total card pool for any given format is robust enough that mana color management is not some ongoing problem. So I feel like Lorcana has really taken this mana color, going to only colorless mana. I think they're solving a problem that doesn't really exist. And by solving it in that way, they've limited deck construction to only 2 colors. So I think overall that's a really bad choice. As far as combat and your creatures exerting to go look for lore, to go questing for lore, the question I have about that is, can you just turtle up, keep casting creatures? If your opponent goes and exerts a creature to quest for lore, you get to pick them off by ganging up on them your next turn, challenging them with a bunch of your creatures, and then you just turtle up until you have a giant death ball of creatures that can quest for 20 lore all at once. Is that really how this is going to work? Because just thinking about how the combat works, the fact that there's no blocking mechanic that I've been able to find means that you just turtle up until you have that death ball and then you win. And also I think this is unfortunate because it kind of pushes back that point in the game where you're going to lose. I could imagine Lorcana games being several turns from the actual end of the game, but knowing you're going to lose at that point. And one thing Magic has always been really great about is having a lot of ability to build into your deck highly variable play when you're in that kind of pinch, when you're on your last viable turn and you need a win this turn because you're going to lose next turn. And I think this kind of mechanic where your opponent quests for lore and you can't actively stop him while he's doing that, it pulls that backwards, where that line in the sand after which you're definitely going to lose is going to be several turns before you actually lose. And so I've always loved Magic where you can do wild things. You can do stuff like Final Fortune, take an extra turn and you lose at the end of it. I mean, it's the ultimate highly variable gameplay that you need when you're behind and you're trying to come back into the game. Or even things like Fire Blast, where you sacrifice land to cast it. I worry that without a blocking mechanic to stop your opponent's characters from questing for lore, you're going to kind of lose that. So I think that is a definite negative in terms of the changes that Lorcana has for Magic. One thing I do like that's different in Lorcana about combat is the idea of challenging. I think that adds a lot of tactical depth. It requires you to think a lot about what you're questing with for lore, or essentially directly attacking your opponent with on one turn, because when that creature gets exerted from questing for lore, your opponent can just come and attack him, challenge him directly on the next turn and kill him. So I think that adds a lot of depth potentially if things don't turn into just being turtle games waiting until you have an army with at least 20 power so you can quest 20 lore all in one turn. So I think that's positive, assuming that the issue of not being able to block your opponent's attempts to quest for lore aren't going to sink the whole game into just staring at each other across the board until one death ball is big enough to win on a single turn. Damage not healing at the end of the turn, I think this is neutral. I think it's interesting. It's a neat difference to take out of Magic. I think mostly the metagame will deal with it in terms of how you decide what creatures are worthwhile to include into a deck, when it's worthwhile to cast them, how you use them. So I think it's potentially interesting, and it'll be up to the meta to get it right. Now, overall, is it a good idea for Lorcana to simply copy Magic? On the plus side, it brings accessibility. If you know how to play Magic, you can probably pick up Lorcana in about 5 minutes. It certainly makes it easy for Magic players to give Lorcana a try. On the other hand, it may turn out that Magic players will think that Lorcana is kind of boring. There's definitely an uphill challenge for Lorcana to say, hey, I'm a clone of Magic, you should come try me. And I think a lot of Magic players might just say, but why? I love Magic. Fab did a lot of innovation away from the existing popular games with its game design, with things like pitching cards for resources. The pitch cards go back into your library, and then effects like Go Again and the combat chain and the decreasing power of your hero as the game goes on. All of those were not necessarily new innovations in TCGs, but the combination of them together made for a game that was substantially different from the existing popular played TCGs. Fab had a great thing going for it, which was in game design, you want games where looking like you're going to win looks like you're going to lose. And what that means is that you want the variability of the gameplay to increase as the game goes on, so that if you're about to win, you should also be almost about to lose. Because the thing that we hate most about games is snowballing. And to give you an example of this, let's think about like professional StarCraft 2. If you watch professional StarCraft 2, if one player manages to kill 2 or 3 workers of their opponents within the first 5 minutes of the game, then the player who did the killing is probably going to win, but it's probably going to take him another 20 or 25 minutes to grind out that win. But that small advantage from the beginning will snowball into a slightly bigger advantage and an even bigger advantage and a huge advantage as time goes on. But essentially, the game was sealed in the first few minutes when he killed those workers. And we don't like that in game design. We want games where someone who gets behind in the beginning has a chance to realistically come back. And yeah, it can happen from time to time in Magic games or even in professional StarCraft or anything else, but overall, your game design needs to not be built around snowballing effects. And that was something that Flesh and Blood did really great, and why they were able to come into a existing, highly mature market for TCGs, bring this novel combination of rules, and was able to be successful. If Lorcana's main claim to accessibility is it's basically Magic, it's going to have a big uphill battle. Magic has over 25,000 unique game pieces in its history. It has 30 years of time to have built out and figured out problems. It has dozens of different play formats. It has the largest network of players, stores, markets, and support. And it has over 120 keywords spread across various formats, various time periods, various expansions. And so it has a huge amount of gameplay depth that Lorcana is going to start at nearly 0 with. And so simply being a clone of Magic may not be enough, because it'll be a bad clone. Copying Magic is a dangerous plan, because Magic is probably going to be better at being Magic than Lorcana will be. Let me know what you think, guys. I know I probably got some of these rules wrong. I know they are kind of in flux, and they, as far as I know, have not been officially released in their entirety yet. So some of this will be overcome by events in the future. But from what I see right now, Lorcana is basically just a ripoff of Magic with very, very small changes around the edges. I am not convinced it will be enough to lure away a bunch of Magic players who are going to be playing a better version of Magic, which is actual Magic. Share your thoughts down below. I'd like to hear them. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Join me on Final Trade.